Thank you very much for having me here. It's been pretty inspiring. For a little bit more background, I was a startup tech founder. I'm not an engineer, so I am the least smart person in the room, absolutely. So don't ask me those questions. But what I have had a whole career kind of figuring out was how to find problems that really mattered to people or to businesses, and to find technological approaches to those solutions. And particularly given what was just discussed about the role that technology should play in problem solving and the responsibility that it has because of the gravity of impact it can have on society, I think is absolutely spot on. I think that we have to think about what we're trying to achieve before we think about too much about how we intend to achieve it. And so during the course of my career, when I look back, I find that I've done that pretty consistently. And I found my way pretty accidentally into this civic tech space. And that's what I want to share with you, because I didn't, when I was building these startups and building early cloud services, before we called them cloud, frankly, I didn't know kind of the impact. I didn't understand the context in which I could use technology to accomplish the goals that we were trying to achieve. And so I had to find that kind of the old-fashioned way, by living through it. And so now I think not only is part of what I'm here to do to hopefully inspire you to think about leveraging your talent, leveraging the genius in this room toward civic challenges, urban challenges that have the ability to profoundly impact society, but also to think about how that might affect the technology that we're developing and why cities in particular are so important. So I'm going to start with some numbers, because I think that might appeal to the room. Again, I started my journey in the civic tech space pretty emotionally and accidentally, and was just benefited by hindsight to realize that I had accidentally ended up in a really important place. And the reason that place is so important is that more people today live in urban centers than do not. For the first time in modern history, 55% of the population lives in urban centers in the world. And a full Singapore, 6 million people move to urban centers every month in the world. So the projection is that 70% or so of people will live in these urban centers by 2030. And some estimates are that could be even higher. So all of the things that even were just discussed in the African context, many of those social challenges and pressures exist in slightly different forms in these urban centers all over the world. And when I say urban center, I don't only mean New York City or Paris or London or Berlin, but I also mean those. Right in the middle of New York City, we're finding people who are not connected to the internet. When I was in San Francisco, I remember a study being done by us, finding that 100,000 people in San Francisco, the self-proclaimed to some extent, center of the technological universe, 100,000 people were unconnected or underconnected to the internet, arguably experiencing many of the same challenges that were described existing in Kenya just a moment ago. Only a little, maybe even more dangerously obscured by the surroundings that they exist in. In New York City, it's 1 million people unconnected or underconnected. In New York City. And so we have to think kind of very clearly about what that means, what the urban center means to the application of technology and the forward-moving progress that can and should be made in an inclusive manner in society. So the other thing that I discovered along the way, that now I have the benefit of a slide to describe, is that it's also where the global GDP is generated. 80% of global GDP is coming from these same urban centers. 90% of patented IP is coming from these urban centers, meaning the resources and the technology is being created in these same places where this societal strife exists in real time. It's also the source of many of the globe's problems. the majority of CO2 emissions coming from urban centers. So what was really interesting to me, and again, I discovered it kind of accidentally and emotionally, was that I was finding myself in the place where we had the opportunity to leverage the world's greatest kind of access to resources against the world's most existential, most grave issues, and impact, and more importantly, involve the most people in that process. So we could have, in the startup days, everything was about scale, right? Nothing mattered if it didn't scale. This is my social impact version of that. This is where I can have impact at scale. It's not to suggest that rural centers are less important. They're just not as easily scaled. So this is where we've centered a lot of our discussions, or at least in my team. The other thing that is how I mentioned that a full Singapore is moving into these urban centers. Well, they're moving from somewhere else. So there's a lot of discussion about diversity. And typically we talk about that, first of all, from the comfort of a Twitter account. But secondly, we talk about it in the context of ethnicity and gender, typically. But I suggest to you that, number one, that's happening in these urban centers. But the urbanization migration is going to drive diversity whether we like it or not. Because these people are moving into these urban centers and they're coming from somewhere else. So by definition, they're driving diversity. Now, the inclusiveness of that diversity, I think, is the really important part. And thinking about, and Merle and I chatted about this yesterday, so I'm going to give her credit for this, but deep diversity. It's not just I don't know what happened, if that's okay, but it's not just about gender and ethnicity, but it's about what your experiences are, what your background is, what your assets are, what your talents are, all of those things. Everyone in this room, even though many of you might look the same in terms of your skin color or your gender, everyone in this room has, or most people in this room have arrived here along a different path. And so that is, I think, something that is not in that statistical slide I just showed, but maybe one of the most important assets that is building, not only exists, but is growing in these urban centers, is the ability to engage diverse perspectives in that IP, that 90% of the world's patented IP that's being developed can and should be informed and influenced by these diverse perspectives. Kind of building on a comment made in the previous presentation that just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think, I experienced this from a city's perspective, that just because I had the resources to build a solution on my own doesn't mean I should. But often we did, because we believed it to be faster. We believed it to be more efficient and more effective to just get on with it and not always involve people in the process. And I think that, again, brings true to what was discussed previously. And so I've described to you the environment that is cities, that it is a place that is becoming more diverse with or without our influence. We can leverage that opportunity. But in a time when people are finding themselves in closer and closer proximity to one another, aka the kind of part of the definition of urbanization, are we really more connected? Are we really collaborating more? Are we really inviting people into that development process, into the solution process, into the process of moving society forward, and into the process of addressing some of these big urban challenges? And I offer to you that largely not. And I think that was when I was invited to come here and speak to this group. I did a little bit of reflection, and I thought to myself, over the last 8 years that I was in public service and another almost decade in startup world, I thought about it, and all along I had a consistent and a philosophical approach to involve others and to, some technologists call it user-centered design. I called it asking the customer or asking the stakeholder. And that was a pretty consistent thread. And then I thought about what relatively speaking, little involvement I'd had with the open source community, and what relatively speaking, little I know about the open source community, and it felt like the underlying principles were very, very similar, that it was about engaging the broader group, almost the intelligence of the crowd and the diverse inputs that should go into building better outcomes. And so I thought about how that relates to the work that I've done in the past with cities and the work that we're doing going forward with cities. And so this is what I'm trying to describe to you, kind of the opportunity and the challenges and that exist in the city space, to get you thinking about that as a venue for the application of your talent, the application of your interests and purpose, and where things can be impacted. And I'm going to give you a quick story about something that I did. This is my own kind of personal experience, not only with the city context I just described, but the open source community and the power of that. In San Francisco, the mayor, who's now passed away, had a dream that he called it permits in pajamas. And if for anyone from San Francisco ever knew Ed Lee, he was that guy. He would come up with the cheesy line, because then you couldn't forget it, right? Pretty effective. And so we went on this mission to have people be able to permit their businesses, new or existing, in their pajamas. And as cheesy as the line might be, it was also a pretty clear mandate. Like, we knew what that meant. And so we went about accomplishing that, and we did a couple of things, a couple of decisions that I made, or that we collectively made, that I can't take credit for being kind of so forward thinking, and that I could predict the value of these decisions. And to some degree, they were just happy accidents. We decided, number one, that we were going to not presuppose the solution, that we were going to take the time to ask the stakeholder group what it meant. Did permits in pajamas even matter to them? And if it did, then how could we help really address something that was a pain point? The second was, we decided we were going to build it as an open source project. Now, we didn't have a huge history in open source in San Francisco. Our website stuff was built on Drupal, and we did some things, but I wouldn't call us, a powerhouse of open source. But we made that decision. Those two decisions proved to be tremendously valuable. One, because we went through this iterative and informed process to build this. And so we learned that it wasn't just about accomplishing the permitting process in your pajamas. It was about, I didn't understand all the different agencies and all the different forms and information that I needed to do to license my new hair salon or my new bakery or my new whatever. And in San Francisco, one unique element is that oftentimes people have a bakery and a hair salon in one business, and they call it something disruptive. So we had these kind of elements of trying to help them understand how to engage the government to accomplish their goal as quickly as they could. And most times these people had day jobs at, let's face it, Google, and were trying to create their own businesses on the side. So the pajama piece actually did matter. But we validated some things, we disproved some other things, but we got to the center of what was really meaningful to the end user, not the way we perceived it. Or it wasn't about, this project wasn't about patting ourselves on the back with our technological prowess and our sophisticated coding and our ability to do what had never been done before. It was just simply about addressing a real need of the constituency. And sometimes that requires, frankly speaking, some courage and some humility. Because you know what we ended up doing? We organized a bunch of information websites. We didn't even digitize the actual application, the permitting process yet, in version 1. We just simply brought all these different processes and confusing workflows and opaque rules, and we just brought them into one place and created this approach that would carry you through what you needed to do for your type of business. So kind of, again, to the earlier point, not to keep referring to that so much, but it wasn't about the technology wasn't the impressive part. It was the simplicity of addressing an actual need that was the impressive part. So what happened was, kind of the validation that that was the smart approach was that while we were expecting some modest uptick in business permitting as a result of our technological contributions, what we actually got was 13x increase in business licensing in San Francisco in the first 3 months. 13x. That was like, kind of hinted back to finally I was in San Francisco, I was the city CIO, so I was like low on the totem pole in the tech ecosystem, right? Across the street was Uber, Square, Twitter, those were my contemporaries. So I was always in the back of the line at the Blue Bottle coffee shop. But finally I had something, I said, hey, I accomplished 13x. Scale, impact, right? Well, how'd you do it? Oh, I built a online informational website. And the engineers in the room, no offense, kind of rolled their eyes. Wow, gee, how long did that take? Like an afternoon? Maybe, but it meant more to those people that mattered to us. They were our customers than some kind of impressive code structures. Now, I'm not speaking ill of the technology, but kind of the point is, does it matter to the end game? Does it matter to the people that you're trying to serve? So that was kind of aha moment, epiphany number one. How important it was to really listen from a place of humility. And with that, you can get clarity to what can have a huge impact on your actual goal. The second was the open source piece. Because we had so much success, we got awards from Ivy League schools, some in our neighborhood, some on the other coast. We got awards from the federal government. We got grants. People were giving us money to do more stuff. It was amazing. Again, all we did was build an informational website. But it was gaining traction. And so what happened, which is not surprising, is down the coast in Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti said, well, if it's good for the Bay, it's good for the Valley. And so he went to his CIO and said, if they can do it, we can do it better. And if you know anything about California, that's about the posture between San Francisco and LA, is this constant back and forth about who lives life better. But in this case, because we had built a relationship between my office and LA City IT office, they picked up the phone and they called us. And that part by itself is not transformative or impressive, really, because that happens all the time, fortunately. But the extent of the exchange or the collaboration, if we even dare call it that, is, hey, what vendor did you use? What lessons learned do you have? Do you have a copy of your RFP? Can my lawyers talk to your lawyers? That kind of thing. And of course, the answer is yes, here's a copy, etc. But what we did, because of our unintentional genius, we said, let me do one better for you. Let me put it on GitHub and give it to you. And so what happened was LA took that source code, implemented the Los Angeles business portal using our project, and improved it and sent it back. And still to this day, this was, if I count, this is probably going on 5 or 6 years ago. And today, and every time I do this part of a presentation, and every time I share this story, I go, just before I got up on stage, I went to business.lacity.com to check that this is still the footer on the website. It's credited, acknowledged as an open source project with San Francisco and a link to the source code. That to me was an achievement that, again, was accidental genius, we'll call it. But they implemented their business portal in a fraction of the time. I did it in a year and change. They did it in a couple months and change, I think. I did it with probably a full decimal point more of money than they did. But we got something back too. They iterated it. We sent it back. And I'm out of my depth in a room like this to tell you all the virtues and values of approaching it this way. But this was fairly novel. This was not the norm. So that was another epiphany. And I said, if I can help accelerate that kind of impact in a neighboring city just simply by answering the phone and responding differently and making some initial decisions differently, then how would this work at scale? How can I make this more about just a connection I have happened to develop between us and a neighboring city, and how can I institutionalize, industrialize this concept of collaboration? So then I decided I was done with my public service chapter. I checked that box, and I ended up joining MasterCard to build this city's program. And a big part of me deciding to come to this particular company and build this particular strategy was that they bought into this concept. At the core of the business, the DNA of the business is partnerships. Our core business, our bread and butter is built on partnerships. And so when I talked about, okay, if we're going to approach cities as a new industry, a new segment, a new opportunity to have both social impact and commercial success, we have to do it collaboratively. And they looked at me like, duh. But I have to tell you, that wasn't the reaction I got from some others that will remain nameless. So we took that approach, and what we've done is created a community of cities. So the strategy is called City Possible. It was up there in the corner. And we took this approach to create this framework around three kind of core ideas. This is not sequential. This is not linear. This is just the three big elements of engagement. And one, at the core of it, is creating this community of cities. So we have this global network of cities that get together and talk about what their challenges are. And through that discussion, sometimes, like San Francisco and LA, they can share a solution among themselves, engage with a community like you, and maybe it has nothing to do with me or MasterCard. And we're okay with that. Because often enough, the challenges haven't been solved, and they do offer an opportunity for us as an organization to make contributions that not only accomplish our objective of positive social impact, but also accomplish our commercial objectives. And let's face it, one of the things, kind of going back to my cities days, one of the things I used to tell the mayors that I worked for, and they were San Francisco and the current Mayor de Blasio in New York, I don't have to tell you what end of the spectrum they're on politically. But I told them, I said, listen, we have the power of the pen today, and we can push budgets into accomplishing our will and having the positive social impact. But by definition, at a specified date, time, and location, we have to hand that pen over to someone else. It's called term limits. Not everywhere in the world, but lots. The two places I worked. And then that next person can stroke the pen in the opposite direction. So, but if we partner with the private sector and we make it commercially viable to have positive social impact, then the private sector becomes the guardian of that social impact and that legacy. And so that was, again, kind of an informative epiphany that I developed over the course of my time in public service that is really baked into this, that we want cities to have the freedom to engage with each other and sometimes solve things without our involvement. Often enough, we will be involved, and when we're going to listen, we're going to build solutions that actually have the impact that we're trying collectively to achieve, and we're going to do it in a way that's good for the business so that we can continue to invest in it, and we can continue to be the guardian of that legacy, to continue to not only protect that positive social impact, but potentially broaden it and grow it. And that's the last bit of here, is to take these things to scale. So we'll co-develop. We might hear a problem from our community, then we might co-develop the solution with a city or two and some partners. And this is the beginning of my invitation to you to think about contributions you can make to this world of urban challenges. But then we have the structure to take it to scale. so that we can help San Francisco metaphorically build a business portal and not limit the sharing to Los Angeles, but extend the sharing to every city on the planet. So we have done a lot of work in public transit, which is the topic of a whole different presentation and discussion, and that has maybe as much impact on society as even things like education and healthcare. We can talk about that later. But we've had a real impact there in a way that's good for our business, but is also materially moving kind of the inclusivity and access of mobility to people in places all over the world. And we've got 30 plus cities and counting, another 110 or 20 in the pipeline of cities that are actively joining this community that we call City Possible as a framework. And now we're inviting private sector partners and academics. Our first partnership in the academia space is with Harvard University, but we're engaging with universities all over the world, with private sector companies all over the world, big enterprise like MasterCard, and small startups in the Valley and in other parts of the world, and the NGO community. And the point of this is back to this notion or this concept of deep diversity. This isn't just about getting people that look different around the table. This is getting organizations that look different around the table. So we have cities in our network that are Dubai and Dublin and Helsinki and San Jose. But we also have Wallandilly Shire, Australia, Altamonte Springs, Florida, and Aurora, Illinois. And that's because I think we are embodying, living that position or that philosophy of diversity is good to build more robust solutions. We want to hear from the big cities. What are those challenges? We want to hear from the small cities. What are those challenges? And how do we bring these things together to build things that scale? So, kind of to wrap up, I hope that what I've encouraged you to think about is the urban space is a place where we collectively can have huge impact in extremely meaningful, extremely important ways at scale. Mayors, I tell people, are my favorite of all politicians because they have to get up in the morning and sometimes deal with things like climate change and global migration and immigration, things that maybe should be national discussions, state-level discussions. And they still have to make sure that potholes are filled and garbage is picked up. And they're very likely to run into you, their constituency, at the local grocery store, at the corner store, at a restaurant. So they're forced to encounter the consequences of their decisions. And so I argue that those are the folks that have the opportunity to have the greatest impact, even in the lives of those. I mean, we should be thinking about this both as contributors and as the recipients of this stuff, because many of us in this room probably live in urban centers. So if we help those things move forward and help them move at an accelerated pace and at scale, then we can impact the lives of people all over the world. And last is that I think there's also a wealth of experience and talent in this room that is openly being sought by cities and governments around the world. In the conversations that we're having with these cities, they're asking us for help making sense of their data sets. They want to understand better how to be objectively informed, data-informed policymakers, but they just don't know how. And so a little bit, again, to the point earlier, I say to people, and I mean this very affectionately, engineers can't help themselves but solve a problem. All we have to do, I think, is present that community with more important problems and then observe the kind of the global societal impact that can happen when we do that. And so that's what our program is about. We're looking forward to very specifically and very aggressively engaging with the open source community and even the Apache Foundation, but just the community at large, to figure out ways that we can bring this superpower into this civic space that has such a tremendous opportunity to impact the lives of people in every corner of the planet. So thank you very much for staying awake and entertaining the discussion, and I hope to see many of you in the future, and thank you very much.